Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you today. Um, Peace, Laura Brarian, Arya, good to see you. Before we get started, the basic things, of course, like share the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're up over 7,000 subscribers now, which it's not a lot compared to a lot of things, but it feels good. So thanks to everybody for subscribing, supporting the channel, and Thanks for all the people who are supporting on Patreon. That's always appreciated. It's the best way to support, especially because the overlords at Google, as Jared Ball likes to call them, have been demonetizing a bunch of our videos lately. And then sometimes they remonetize them. So rather than playing those games with them around, ad revenue and things like that, it's awesome if people just want to contribute $1 or more to the Patreon. And then you see everything. Like, it's a good place to see, obviously all the content we put out there. You get emails letting you know that all the videos, when they're scheduled for, you get an email for each audio episode that comes out, as well as if Josh or I write something or do something else, you get it there too. So there's good stuff there, as well as notifications on study groups. So we do have one that starts next week, actually, on one of the books that's behind me, Trinity of Fundamentals, which is a book that was smuggled out of Palestinian prisoners, written by a PFLP activist militant named Wissam Rafidi, who thankfully is still with us. And so anyways, there's a lot of cool stuff there. I encourage folks to check that out. For this discussion today, so we've had a couple conversations with Alex Aviña now. I'm going to try to cajole him into doing this on a regular basis, as he does for a lot of other dope podcasts too, like The East is a Podcast and Guerrilla History and Rev Left Radio. So always good to be with him. And then also going to be with a close friend. I don't know how close he considers me, a friend of mine, but hopefully a close friend, David Chávez, who is also works in history and ethnic studies. So I'll introduce David first. He's been on the show once before. So he was on an audio podcast that I did with Alejandro Villalpando, David, and Stephen Osuna, when we kind of did a reflection on a panel we had done at the Abolitions Conference in DC, which was interesting and kind of weird experience, but we all had some fun meeting up and having our reflections from that. So David Chávez teaches history and ethnic studies at Compton College. His dissertation was on LA's war on Black and Chicana youth from 1945 to 1965. It's called From Delinquents to Street Terrorists. Chávez has studied the policing and criminalization of those populations in greater Los Angeles. He also has many years organizing experience, including with critical resistance in LA. And so I'm honored to have him join us. And he's going to kind of, in a lot of ways, lead this discussion a little bit. And then Alex Aviña is a historian and professor. He is currently an associate professor of history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. His research focuses on 20th century Mexico with an emphasis on revolutionary movements, including the Mexican left, state violence, terrorism, immigration, and the history of narcotics production and trafficking. He is the author of the book Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. And I should say that book is we're talking kind of about a part of that book or a section, and a figure, Lucio Cabañas, today. But that is, if folks pick up that book, it goes more into that history than we'll be able to fully touch on today. So just to give folks an idea that that is kind of part of what we're discussing here today. So anyways, I am going to bring Alex and David to the show. Let's do it that way. All right, welcome.
How's it going, Jay?
Hey, David, for having us.
Yeah. Good to be with you both. Excited to have this conversation. Always fun to talk about school teachers who are also peasant guerrillas, and so I'm excited about that. So let's start with just kind of a little bit of an introduction. Alex, why don't you start off with just giving us some background on who Lucio Cabañas is, why he's an important figure in your book, Specters of Revolution. And can you start by just saying, yeah, a little bit about who he was and some of the kind of the central dynamics that you were studying in that book to kind of bring folks into this conversation as an entry point?
Yeah, for sure. So Lucio Cabañas was a communist rural school teacher in Mexico during the 1960s. He was born and lived in the southwestern Mexican state of Guerrero, which most folks could find on the map by looking at some of their resort towns like Acapulco or Zihuatanejo, Ixtapa. Lucio came from a family of revolutionaries, great uncles who fought in the Mexican Revolution, aligning themselves with one of the more radical factions of the Mexican Revolution, which was led by Emiliano Zapata. It's actually his birthday today, August 8th, 1879. Lucio grew up in Guerrero, grew up amongst a lot of poverty. His father at one point was assassinated by gunslingers. He eventually managed to gather enough resources so he could go to the Ayotzinapa Rural Teacher Training School in Guerrero, which is one of these bastions of like Mexican defined versions of communism. These rural teacher training schools that were set up after the 1910 Mexican Revolution, explicitly to train the sons and daughters of Mexican campesinos to become rural school teachers and then go back to their communities and teach. He was there in Ayotzinapa in the late 1950s, and he writes about it in terms of like that's where he became politically radicalized. This idea that you're not just a rural school teacher, but you're in service of peasant communities and you're in service of the revolution. The Mexican Revolution was supposed to be something that was alive. It was supposed to be a process. Depending on which Mexican and which part of the state you were talking to, the Mexican Revolution, lived well into at least the 80s and the 90s. But that's another conversation for another day, I suppose. So Lucio gets involved. He eventually joins the Mexican Communist Party sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. He gets involved with these massive social movements that erupt in the state of Guerrero in the early 60s. First, to get rid of a pretty horrific, nepotistic, brutal state governor. Then he forms part of an opposition political party campaign in 1962 both of these movements get drowned in blood by different agents of the Mexican state. Lucio then starts to teach, he starts to teach in coastal Guerrero. But as soon as he starts to teach, he becomes embroiled in like local community struggles because that's what he does, right? That was the essence of being a normalista, right? Like you were not just going to teach, literacy and basics to your students, but you were going. It's almost like these normalistas for a while had anticipated like Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Because these schools did come out as a sort of conquest, a popular conquest of the Mexican Revolution. So as soon as he starts teaching, he gets embroiled in local community conflicts, protecting forestry resources against local political and economic bosses. He causes so much problems that they end up like exiling him to northern Mexico for a bit, the state of Durango. He ends up getting embroiled in local community struggles there over control of local community resources. By the time he comes back to Guerrero in the late 60s, he once again gets involved in the local community struggle at the school level in a place called Atoyac de Alvarez, which is the epicenter of the guerrilla movement that he will later found. In 1967, there's a massacre, May 18th, 1967, there's a massacre of the parents of school children who were protesting against a really unpopular school rector. During that massacre, state police tried to assassinate Lucio Cabañas. He manages to escape with the help of the local community, goes up into the mountains and initiates like a 7-year-long process of armed struggle that begins as an instance of like armed self-defense, but then ends up becoming, Mexico's most important rural guerrilla struggle after 1960. ends up organizing a guerrilla movement called the Party of the Poor. Depending on estimates, he had anywhere from 100 to 300 full and temporary fighters. He had the support of dozens of rural communities in coastal Guerrero. Probably had a pretty good level of political and military influence in about 5 to 6 municipalities, which in Mexico, municipality is kind of akin to a county, but bigger sort of entities, kind of different structure. So this rural communist school teacher ends up becoming leader of the most consequential rural guerrilla movement in Mexico since the 1960s. And to defeat his movement, the Mexican military launched what activists and researchers now refer to as a dirty war. This really brutal, violent counterinsurgency that disappeared hundreds of people, tortured, raped hundreds of people, bombed peasant villages, inaugurated the use of something called death flights, these things that we see in other Latin American countries where people would be placed onto helicopters or Israeli-made airplanes, and they would fly from Acapulco Air Force bases and dump people into the Pacific Ocean. And Lucio himself was killed fighting against the Mexican military on December 2nd, 1974. So this year marks the 50th year anniversary of his death, and the first defeat of the guerrilla movement that he led. Because even though the movement more or less stops after his death, it will reorganize and reemerge in the late 70s and early 80s, and then will really reemerge in the 1990s. So there's throughout like the long array of Mexican history, when we look at armed struggle and guerrilla movements, there's like a very cyclical nature to it, which to me as a historian makes it fascinating. And it also shows that you may kill guerrilla leaders, you may kill radicals, but you cannot kill their ideas, and their ideas manage to live on. Similar with Emiliano Zapata, whose birthday we remember today, is something similar with Lucio Cabañas as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for laying all that out. I think your book Specters of Revolution really does lay out, like you did like a great summary of it. It was like very very clear on the important figure of Lucio Cabañas and the larger movement in Guerrero at that time. And I want to pick up on something you just kind of mentioned right now, the kind of cyclical nature of insurgency, or of something that you've also named, or taken, agreed, this idea of the importance of the commune in Mexico, la comuna mexicana, as you call it. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak a little bit on that, because I think there is these important figures like Zapata. There is, especially, I'm coming, I guess, as a, from the Chicano perspective, but even just the more U.S. perspective. When we look at revolutionary Mexico, it kind of does get captured as a singular kind of time. Maybe it'll also include, the 1800s and the Grito de Dolores and things like that in the independence movement. And I can see it kind of more today, where even the 90s guerrilla, or the guerrilleros in Chiapas, with the Zapatistas, is even kind of now falling out of like common discourse. I felt like in 2004, 2005, when especially the Sexta Declaración de la Cadona, like when that came out, that was really, there was like a lot of, I think, energy. But now it's but even with all of that, it still feels like I really want to pick up or give you some space to talk about, right, this kind of cyclical nature, and like the importance of how the commune as a political formation within Mexican historiography, or within Mexican political life, has been something that has been really animating. And it's not just isolated to these like very regional or very time specific areas, but it's actually very expansive, where you can kind of see it in these different ways.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. That's a great question. I'll start at the end, because you mentioned the EZLN, the Zapatistas. That moment when this movement emerges in 1994, shocking the world, it also did something for historians, which was really to crack open Mexican history and to lead people to question, like, where did these guerrillas come from? And that led to this process of interrogation, that when people started to research the origins of the EZLN, it led them to this other, like, almost forgotten history of Mexican guerrilla movements from the 60s and 70s. So one of the great contributions, political and historical contributions, of the EZLN was to crack open Mexican history and to allow historians to then come in and recover the history of armed struggle in 1960s and 70s Mexico that was it was not mainstream. It was not known, right? Obviously the survivors and the victims of Mexican state terror like did talk about it, and they did organize, and they did risk their lives, to ask for things like bring back our disappeared loved ones. And even people, Subcomandante Marcos in his early writings would talk about that, would reference these earlier movements from the 60s and 70s. So I think they had a really important function. Personally, it was like the moment where I felt like I was becoming personally radicalized. 1994 was a crazy year, right? We had the Zapatistas, and I grew up in California. We had Prop 187, and I was in like middle school. So I felt like, and I, growing up with two undocumented migrant parents, right? Like all this stuff came together in 94, right? So it's all like, personally, it's like, I have a soft spot for the Zapatistas in many different ways. The broader question about the Mexican commune. So this is an idea that I've been working with based on the work of this like critical theorist, writer, scholar, Bruno Bostils, who a couple years ago started to try to like decolonize or internationalize the Paris Commune, and to think about the Paris Commune is not like the sole political referent for possible communism, right? Like we needed to look elsewhere in the world for historical examples. And he turned to Mexico. And in his book, which should be coming out in English pretty soon, it was published in Spanish first, La Comuna Mexicana. He kind of traces this subterranean history of popular struggles from like, he goes all the way back to like the Nochitlan and like the 1500s and the Calpulli, which is, as a historian, I'm like, I can't stretch it that far, right? Like, but he's a critical theorist. He can do it. He can tie these things together. But essentially what he's trying to do is rewrite a history of Mexico that's subterranean, that's from below, that's hidden. And to him, this is the history of the Mexican commune, the history of different popular movements who've attempted to enact self-government in which the workers and the producers and the peasants are the ones who determine the everyday conditions of their existence. And when I started as a grad student, when I started researching Lucio Cabañas' movement, I kept going back and back in history because I kept seeing the same demands. Obviously, context matters and all that, but I kept seeing the same demands dating back to like the independence wars of the late 19th century, right? Like peasants wanted land, peasants wanted to abolish agrarian rent, peasants wanted political power, peasants wanted to localize political, economic, and social power so it remained under their control and not in some faraway place like Mexico City. And just to state like a fact, right? Mexico was an overwhelming rural country until about the 1960s or 1970s when it became an urban majority country. So the countryside, the campesino community plays a huge role in Mexican history. And these efforts are constant. Sometimes they emerge and they coalesce into bigger movements of armed struggle that then leave a huge impact in the development of a nation state we refer to as Mexico. So Mexico is one of the, I would say, two countries whose independence movement was simultaneously a social revolutionary movement, right? Haiti being the other one. And to my knowledge and the way I teach it, Haiti remains to me the most radical Latin American and Caribbean revolutionary movement for a variety of reasons. But the Mexican effort to gain independence also begins as a social revolution, right? And then 100 years later in 1910, you have the first massive social peasant-led, peasant-created social revolution in the world in the 20th century, right? The 20th century has a history of peasant revolutions globally. It begins in Mexico. And between those 100 years, you have all these peasant movements, some violent, some not, some both. And their ideas exist underground, and they continue to feed and to nourish future revolutionary movements. So ideas like peasants should control the conditions of their everyday existence. They should control their land. They shouldn't have to work for anybody. They should determine what kind of political configuration they want to enact. They should be able to enact any sort of system of production that they deem fit, right? Like unmotivated by a profit motive, usually, right? More subsistence, grassroots democratic subsistence production. And those ideas, even if they get defeated militarily by different Mexican state configurations, they just simply go underground and they continue to nourish future revolutionary movements. So like for my dissertation, I ended up like in the 1700s. And when I tried to publish that dissertation as a book, the editor was like, no, we cannot go. Your movement is about the 1960s and 70s. We will not go back to like the 1780s. But I'm like, so like the first chapter of my book, I try to condense, I don't know how many pages into, trying to show that these revolutionary movements in the 60s and 70s that are obviously influenced by things like the Cuban Revolution, they're influenced by Vietnam, they're influenced by Algeria, they're influenced by this particular global moment of insurgency and revolution. Nonetheless, they have organic roots, they have local roots, and they have long stretching historical roots that you can go back to the Mexican Revolution of 1910 with people like Emiliano Zapata. In my research, I encountered like Zapatista veterans, like these old men in their 70s who helped out the Party of the Poor movement led by Lucio Cabañas, right? They provided expertise, they provided medical care, they served as messengers, they helped Lucio obtain communal support from different communities. So there's a very real material link, but there's also an ideological and political one. And that link is this idea, again, of the Mexican commune, this idea that the people at the bottom, the workers, the producers, they're the ones who should have political, economic, and social power. And that's what animates these revolutionary movements, even though, depending on context, we have additions to that political register, whether it's socialism, whether it's communism, whether it's anarchism, whatever. But there's still these like elementary aspects of the Mexican commune that has proved to be pretty consistent across, I would say, at least 200 years.
Right on. I want to bring in an audience question here, because it also partly because it connects with something that I wanted to ask you, Alex, which is this person's from Guerrero, and how is it that this kind of history is being forgotten from being taught in public schools? What's the purpose for censoring this part of history? And I think, I can't remember which one of your pieces, Alex, but I think you say something kind of interestingly similar about like being at a market, right? And people selling like different radical iconography, including some stuff from the Zapatistas, but there was nothing commemorating Lucio Cabañas. And there was some comment from the vendor, I think, right, that was like, yeah, that would be too radical or something like that. That wouldn't be, that would be frowned upon or whatever. So yeah, say a little bit about this.
Sure. So why it's not being taught? Well, the figure and the movement of Lucio Cabañas hasn't been domesticated or defanged to the point that it can then be co-opted by the Mexican state. It can't. One immediate reason is because he killed like a lot of Mexican soldiers, and the Mexican military will not allow the Mexican state, even in a more left configuration, from trying to co-opt and to use his imagery to gain some sort of political legitimacy, like it did with the figure of Emiliano Zapata. Beginning in the Zapata's assassinated in 1919, but then in the subsequent decades, like the Mexican state did a pretty good job of co-opting his, they defanged him to a certain extent, and they co-opted his image. And they've done that to all the radical leaders of Mexican history. It took them a little longer for Pancho Villa, because Pancho Villa did something unprecedented in Mexican history, which was to raise an army of like 40 to 50,000 peasants with trains and their own little air force during the Mexican Revolution. I think it took until like the 1960s for him to be co-opted. Even the other communist school teacher that I talk about in the book, Genaro Vázquez, even he's been co-opted to a certain extent. I know the current president of Mexico, López Obrador, during one of his presidential campaigns, maybe in 2006, like he would talk about Genaro Vázquez when he'd go to Guerrero, right? So it was safe to talk about him, but they won't talk about Lucio that much. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous for a lot of reasons. One reason is that you could say that there's still elements of this revolutionary process from the 70s that are still around to this day. So the example that you talked about, Jay, I borrowed from a really good Mexican journalist by the name of Diego Osorno. And he talks about that when he went to the capital city in Guerrero, is called Chilpancingo. So when he went to their market and he saw all these shirts, right, that Zapata shirts, Subcomandante Marcos shirts, Pancho Villa shirts, and he asked her, like, well, where are the Lucio Cabañas shirts? This is Guerrero. And she's like, no, I don't sell those, because as soon as I sell those, the government starts to come around and ask questions. And then she makes a really interesting point to Osorno, where she says they think that by killing him, Lucio is dead, if only they knew. You're not going to teach that in public schools in Mexico, especially not public schools in Guerrero. There are popular efforts to commemorate and to remember Lucio Cabañas and Genaro Vázquez. They'll name schools after them, but that's like a local effort. In Atoyac de Alvarez, that city, that Lucio's from, or that municipality where Lucio's from, there is a big statue now of Lucio Cabañas that took a lot of effort, local effort, and political contestation to actually be able to put up a statue and an obelisk to commemorate Lucio. But he's not really taught in public schools because he's dangerous. This is like a history that remains alive and dangerous. I remember one of the ex-guerrilla guys that I talked to when I was writing the book, he would tell me, he's like, I can't talk to you about different military operations because some of the caciques that we killed, their family members are still alive and they still want to get me. So he's like, I'm not going to give you details. Or to give another example, there's a truth commission investigating Mexico's dirty war that López Obrador created. And just last year, they found the remains of 7 campesinos who had been executed by the Mexican military in 1974, including a 14-year-old boy. So this shit is still alive and well, in especially in Guerrero. And it's simply a really dangerous history, particularly when it's a figure of a school teacher like Lucio, and particularly when he presents an alternative model of pedagogy and what we can do with the knowledge that we accumulate through schooling, right? Like he provides a really radical example of what we could do. Also, I think the final reason why is when I mentioned the name Ayotzinapa, the viewers thought about what happened to the 43 Ayotzinapa students in 2014, September of 2014. We're approaching 10-year anniversary of that horrible event where 43 of these male students who were training to be school teachers from the same school that Lucio Cabañas came from were disappeared by a constellation of like military, police, narcos, and like local political officials, right? And we still, they're disappeared. They remain disappeared. 2 of those young men were Lucio's nephews, right? So from his family. So again, this remains a hot, dangerous history, right? And that's why, to answer the viewers, that's my long-winded question to answer the viewers' question. That's why you're not going to necessarily get that information, through formal schooling in Mexico.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And I think I really like the framing that you said of this of Lucio Cabañas and of the Partido de los Pobres, like being still very active, or like what you say in your book, like haunting, right? It's something that hasn't gone away, and it hasn't been able to be sanitized by the state of Mexico in probably the ways it wants, or if it could, like they've done to Zapata, and kind of speaking on that, something that you read a little bit about is even the influence that Cabañas still has, even for like the international, while he was alive, but even after even though it's not popular discourse, people still sought out the information, the communiques from Cabañas or from the Partido. And in particular, one thing you mentioned is one example of it in your writing of it actually influencing a Chicano or Chicane revolutionary group here in the U.S. And I kind of want to ask you about that, or maybe you can speak on it, because one of the things that I see, within the co-opting of Mexican history, I feel like here in the States, there's kind of a very selective there's a very selective way that Chicano history is laid out, or what influenced the Chicano movement or the Chicane movement of the 60s. And Cabañas, and also the guerrillas of the 60s, and even, as you write about, and other folks write about in the 50s in Mexico, is not really captured as much. Like they seem to be disconnected, or like happening on almost 2 different planes, when when there's probably a lot more overlap. And so I'm wondering too, if I'm wondering if this thread of co-opting has also not only impacted Mexico's understanding, or in the attempt to erase people like Cabañas, or to marginalize the active histories of the multiple guerrilla movements in Mexico for the Mexican state or the Mexican population, but also here, like how the type of counterinsurgency of what is filtered into the official Mexican history in the U.S., for the 30 million Mexicanos, or Chicanos or Chicane community who live here, right? And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or you kind of see the same way, where there's like certain figures that we can talk about within the canon of Chicano studies, right? Of Mexican figures. I think there's a lot. There's a ton to say. You're a historian of Mexico, so you probably have a lot of thoughts on the way the Chicano history is done, or Chicane history is done. I do too, but I don't know if you can kind of speak on that, or if it kind of like sparks any thoughts on you, because I do see it as, we have, going back, something that you were kind of like hesitant to go back to. We have the Cuauhtemocs, right? We have the Moctezumas. We have the generalized Adelita from the revolution. We have Zapata. We have Villa. In kind of like popular senses, but then it kind of just kind of tails off a little bit, right? I don't feel like there is a big focus on the 50s and 60s, and I think it's by design. I think it's the way that the U.S. Academy is, when they were willing to accept Chicano studies. It kind of came out of that. I don't know, but yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. I wonder what your thoughts are in that, as someone who teaches. I'm sure your histories of Mexico are very different than, or maybe you've taught your Chicano history classes, and how they're a lot different. Your approaches to that, and also how it's sanitized here.
So many thoughts on this.
I don't want to get you in trouble, Alex. I'm not trying to get you in trouble, Alex, with your colleagues or nothing. But,
no, I will say, I don't think we're gonna see. No, I don't think I'm allowed at Knox.
I was gonna say I don't think Knox wants you anyways, but
no, I don't think so. Okay, so we're not gonna see Lucio on a panaderia calendar. No, those are reserved for like Cuauhtemoc or some Aztec warrior.
You got
right. And there's also a reason why I'm not a historian of, Chicana history, but that's a different conversation. No, I think some of this is, and this is like a division, right, in the history of like the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s, right? Some of this falls on that division between like cultural nationalism and like the left, like Marxism, right, like, or communism, whatever. It's can cultural nationalism, like, how can cultural nationalism co-opt or domesticate a figure like Lucio Cabañas? It's quite obviously like not. I mean, he is a nationalist to a certain, like, in the national liberation mode, but he's also a communist. So I think, but one of the things, and I think this is, I think, just screaming for, like, just begging for more research, is to think about the actual really existing material political links that existed between radical Chicano movements and guerrilla movements in Mexico. Because I thought there wasn't going to be much interface between the two. And then when I read, so the Party of the Poor, Partido de los Pobres, they put out two like manifestos. And their first manifesto, one of their demands is like, or one of their points was to demonstrate solidarity with the Native American, Black, and Chicano civil rights movements in the United States. And I'm like, why are you guys are up in the mountains of Mexico? Why are you like using one of your points in your manifesto to talk about that? And it, they had shortwave radios, like they were listening to the news about what was going on in the US, but they also had like actual links with radical Chicanos who were like smuggling weapons into Mexico to these different revolutionary movements. And we just need more research. The research that's been done has focused on a different group led by Florencio Medrano, who was also from Guerrero, born in Guerrero, but he had a Maoist background. He actually went to China in the late 60s, early 70s. He ended up forming a party called El Partido Proletario por la Unidad de América, or something like PPUA. And he actually did interface and organize with radical Chicanos, like one Mario Cantu, who's based in San Antonio, who published the newspaper of the PPUA, who smuggled, I think he was doing some smuggling to Mexico. And this led to a really interesting transnational vision where Florencio Medrano, his nickname was El Güero Medrano, he viewed the Chicano question as inseparable from, the liberation of Chicanos in the Southwest is inseparable from the liberation of Mexico, period. And he viewed the U.S. Southwest as, almost like the occupied part of Vietnam. And that also would require liberation, and not just southern Mexico or the rest of Mexico. That movement, and I have a homie at UT San Antonio, Jerry Gonzalez, who's currently researching, writing about Mario Cantu, who's a really enigmatic figure. He's a really interesting dude. But a compa of mine here at Arizona State, Alan Eladio Gomez, has a book about the radical Chicano imagination, and he has a chapter that really focuses on the connection between these radical Chicano movements and the PPUA, led by El Güero Medrano. But we need more. We need more research, because I think there's actual material and political links. And then you start reading some of the publications of radical Chicano movements, and they're constantly referencing someone like Lucio Cabañas, and they will reference him as like the new Emiliano Zapata. There's a new Mexican revolution happening in southern Mexico, and it's being led by this new Emiliano Zapata. And that was always like a point of comparison to Lucio, although he rejected it, but that he was constantly being referred to as like another Emiliano Zapata or a new Emiliano Zapata, both by, you know, political groups within Mexico and political groups outside of Mexico. And Chicano movements, you know, the radical ones we're talking about these movements, even though there was a lot of censorship, even though it was really difficult to get information. I think even like the Black Panther Party newspaper at one point mentioned Lucio Cabañas's movement in an issue that had like one of the famous images of Emiliano Zapata with his like charro outfit and his sword in one hand and the rifle in the other. And then in the late 70s, you had groups like the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee and these other really other groups that like actually not much has been done on, that were trying to make connections of a variety of different ways with the ongoing revolutionary struggles in Mexico during the 1970s. There's one group called, what was it, like the New Movement of Solidarity with the Puerto Rican and Mexican Revolutions, that was publishing stuff like in the late 70s and early 80s, and they were publishing stuff about Lucio Cabañas even after Lucio's death. Right, so there's something there, I think, that like someone who's brave enough to transnationalize like Chicanx history could do. But I think, you know, for those of us who focus on Mexico, I think we also have to do the same. I think one of the things that, you know, folks like Christina Heatherton are doing, and Bruno Bastilles, is like internationalizing or globalizing the impact of radical Mexican movements. Like, it's really important, right? Like, these movements had a global impact. Christina Heatherton has a great book that just came out last year on the global impact of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and how it influenced folks from like W.B. Du Bois to radical movements in the U.S. You know, Bruno Bastilles' whole point about the Mexican commune is to show that in many ways, these radical Mexican movements and imaginaries anticipated things like the Paris Commune, the Mexican Revolution anticipated the Russian Revolution, right? It came before it. But these Mexican movements are not necessarily thought of as having some sort of like transnational impact, when in actuality they did. And I think that's, at least for as a historian of Mexico and in these revolutionary movements, I think that's one way we can you know, continue to do new research and new writings to show some of this impact. Because then, you know, there's a way to understand. I'll leave it at that. Like, I think there's a parochialism that we need, the political and radical parochialism that we need to disrupt. And, you know, there's things like, I'll end with this. One of the examples that I think about this a lot is that in 1918, Emiliano Zapata wrote a letter to Lenin. And he's like, look, the revolutionary cause in Mexico is the same as the revolutionary cause in Russia. It's the same process. And what unites it, in Zapata's words, was, quote, that great theft of peasant lands. And then he congratulates Lenin and says that keep being successful. You know, those kind of international and transnational connections are the things that we need to continue to dig up. I mean, they're there. They just require more research. And I think they could be really important for more, you know, for non-academic things, right? For like political organizing.
Right on. I'm just going to pull in one more audience question because I think this also gets to some of the dynamics of like counterinsurgency and, you know, what it means to be a ruling state power. But if the PRI was based on revolutionary, you know, ideology, how is it that the party tried to suppress the revolution of the people and has sided with the oligarchy? So maybe I mean, I know that's a big question and probably would require a lengthy answer. But yeah, if you could share a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because it speaks to the points that both you, Jay, and David have made, is that there's a reason why the history of movements like the Party of the Poor are relatively unknown. And part of this has to do with the PRI in Mexico managed to suppress these movements, not just militarily, physically, but also politically, because looking at Mexico in the 60s and 70s from the outside in, Mexico was a revolutionary nationalist progressive government. It was a government that was, quote unquote, born from the 1910 Mexican Revolution. So in that sense, how could you have revolutionary movements up in the mountains of Guerrero when the government itself was already quote unquote revolutionary? So Mexico had like 30 to 40 armed revolutionary movements that took up that tried to overthrow the Mexican government from the 60s and the 70s up until the early 80s. And they had that double burden, right? It wasn't just like actually overthrowing the government, which is huge and nearly impossible, but they also had an ideological one. They had to show that the government actually was not revolutionary, was not nationalist, was not progressive. It was actually in full service of what they would refer to as North American capitalists or the U.S. empire. And that's the kind of language that Lucio would use. And then so internationally, the Mexican government did a great job of positioning itself as like a progressive revolutionary regime, like a third way regime. They were one of the only, if not the only, Latin American country for a long time to maintain open diplomatic relations with revolutionary Cuba. Fidel Castro was really good friends with high-ranking PRI, political, and police officials. So there was never going to be any sort of Cuban support for Mexican movements, military or otherwise, because Mexico was like the one ally that they had, right, through much of the Cold War. Even though we know now that secretly the Mexican government was like passing along information to the Americans about the Cubans, but that's another story. So, these Mexican groups like the Party of the Poor were amongst the most isolated in the region, in Latin America. And they, with very few exceptions, they didn't receive any sort of outside help. Some did from Chicano movements. There's one group that actually trained like 100 or so of their fighters in North Korea, which is a really interesting story. I interviewed a guy who was a part of this movement, and the leaders from this movement called the MAR, Movimiento de Acción Revolucionaria. The leaders had at one point been studying at the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow. They had gotten a scholarship from the Mexican Communist Party. They went to study there. And then they saw what was happening in Mexico in the late 60s, particularly after the Tlatelolco student massacre. And they're like, no, we got to, like, what are we doing here? We got to go take the revolution back home. So this guy was telling me how they went to all the embassies of like the revolutionary regimes, and they all got denied, like asking for help. They went to the Cubans, they went to the Vietnamese, they went to the Algerians, and everyone's like, no, get the hell out of here. We're not going to, what? No. The only embassy was like, yes, we will help you, and we will actually take you to our country and train you. And they trained somewhere about 100 to 150 militants, was North Korea. This movement ended up getting infiltrated relatively soon and was disarticulated, but some of their cadres went and joined other groups. One of those groups they joined was the Party of the Poor, and they taught the Party of the Poor how to do things like ambushing military convoys, which ended up being pretty useful for the Party of the Poor because they did that 1972, 1973, 1974. But again, so because Mexico already had a certain international standing, because they were accepting exiles from South American countries that had succumbed to military dictatorships, like they had all these, like the government, the PRI had leftist credentials, and they could use that ideologically to then turn around and tell the world either these guerrillas don't exist, or they would say they're just terrorists. When they talked about urban guerrillas, they would pathologize them. They would say that there's an infamous speech in 1974, a State of the Union speech, where the Mexican president, Lucio Cabañas, went on this rant about where he pathologized urban guerrilla movements as terrorists who were also alcoholics, drug addicts, and in his words, a high degree of homosexuality. So like completely just othering these groups, right? With the campesino guerrillas, what they would do is just say they're not guerrillas, they're just like cattle thieves, they're bandits, they're narco traffickers. And people believe them because, again, the PRI had that image, that international image, that they were the true heirs of the Mexican Revolution and that they were a progressive regime within the confines of Latin America. And then Luis Echeverria ends up leading the Zionism is racism charge at the UN in the mid-1970s, right? So people from the outside looking in would say, well, no, that government is already revolutionary. There's no way that there's going to be other revolutionary movements trying to unseat it. So ideologically, the PRI had a lot of power that allowed it to suppress the histories of these different revolutionary movements.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think in your book, you really talk a lot about that, how you say something to the effect of, that the folks, Lucio Cabañas and then Genaro Vasquez and those part of the ACG, right? They were organizing for 8 years with like the Constitution in their hand. I think you kind of said, you kind of say it like that, right? Trying to hold this revolutionary promise of the Mexican Constitution and the revolution, before they, finally came to a point, right? And I don't know if you can. I think it's really great if you can talk about it too. Is how much it took for people to take up arms and join an armed struggle, and,
Yeah.
and understand that this is our route now. We've tried these multiple avenues, multiple different ways of trying to meet the demands of the peasantry, of the poor, um, and utilizing the language, constitutional language. But when they got to a certain point, and as well as the repression, right? Which maybe we could talk a little bit about too. And I know Jared has some questions around counterinsurgency, but um, yeah, when we look at this case, I think it's a really interesting thing for us to study if we're thinking about social movements, internationalism, or um, how a clandestine insurgency starts, or a guerrilla, like how it starts. That it's not just, unlike what the Mexican media tries to portray, and like all these, every state does. If people pick up arms, well, then they use these names or try to discredit them and say, well, they just came out of nowhere, right? Rather than having this longer history of getting to this point, right, of armed struggle, a lot, not just the Partido de los Pobres, but like you said, like dozens of communities feeling that's probably going that same route, right, of trying to use the Mexican Constitution, but coming to these roadblocks. But more than that, getting repression, the type of violence and massacres that happen to them. So yeah, I don't know if there's any like salient points that you want to bring up in terms of like the development of the like selecting armed struggle that that you found in studying Mexican history. Because I think those are really important points, because we can, with even myself, right, as a younger person, right, it becomes very romanticized and engaging in armed struggle, right? And then Hollywood takes it up and just makes a bunch of a mockery out of it. If they try to ever do like a film on a revolution, right, it becomes very like a mockery. But I think when we look at it and you study it, or again, speak to any points that you want to bring up to it, it's a slower process of development, but that the people are leading it. The in the words, I think, of Cabañas and the Partido de los Pobres, right? Just because people were seeing a massacre doesn't mean the next day they wanted to pick up arms. Like there had to be dialogue, discussion, and development of a revolutionary consciousness. Not even a revolutionary consciousness. People had that, but having an armed struggle as our route to revolution, right? So I don't know if there's any salient points that you think, because I think there's a lot in the way you write about it. But yeah, if you speak in any salient points on that.
Yeah, David, that's a great question. The big question that really animated my book was like, why do poor people rebel? Like why, it's an old sociological question, right? Like why risk it all for some sort of undefined, uncertain, an extremely dangerous endeavor for an uncertain result, right? Like it's truly like a leap into the open air of history, I think, is Walter Benjamin terms it. And what I discovered in Guerrero is that, not surprising, people aren't born with like Kalashnikovs, right? And berets. Like revolutionaries are made, they're not born, right? So I thought about, what made these people revolutionaries, willing to adopt armed struggle and revolutionary violence? And one of the other questions that really animated this research, or things that animated it, was at the time when I started doing this in the 2000s, is that historiographically there was a lot of emphasis put by, I think, some more or less bad faith historians that just blamed everything on Cuba. So Cuba was responsible for like pulling the strings of all these revolutionary movements in Cold War Latin America. And I always thought that was I thought that was wrong for a lot of reasons, but particularly in the Mexican case, especially for the reasons that I already discussed. So I really wanted to show radical political radicalization as a process. And that's one of the reasons why I had to stretch out this history and go back all the way to the 1700s, is to show how, what sort of factors radicalize individuals and communities into thinking that armed struggle is a feasible political option more than anything, right? It's not some sort of like cultural or psychological or pathological decision, right? It's a political decision made for very specific reasons. And what I try to show in the book is to show that these, a guerrilla leader like Lucio Cabañas, who starts as a communist rural school teacher, like it took him a lot of state terror and violence to his people, to his community, and to himself individually to finally flee up into the mountains like so many Mexicans before him and say, look, the only recourse I have left to gain for the redress of grievances and to make the government live up to its own promises, right? Like the 1917 Mexican Constitution was in its moment one of the most radical social democratic constitutions in the world, right? It was talking about economic, political and economic sovereignty and to provide social rights for people. Like that in 1917, when this gets promulgated, it's a radical document that only gets superseded by the Russian Revolution. So a lot of the struggle that Lucio and other social movements engaged in Mexico during the 50s, 60s, and 60s especially, is to make the government live up to its own promises, live up to its own constitution. And, you know, they organized in the open, they did protests, they wrote letters, they wrote petitions, they followed the law. And at every turn, they were met with violence. And not just violence, but escalating levels of state violence to the point where you have military soldiers shooting people down. So at that point, you do have these social movements that were based on the Mexican Constitution, that were nationalistic, that believed in, to a certain extent, the PRI as being like the inheritor of the Mexican Revolution. They basically get hit over the head so many times. They're like, look, they betrayed the revolution. That's the language they use. So we have to go and make a new revolution. Or actually, the language they'll use is like, we have to redeem the Mexican Revolution. Like the Mexican Revolution was betrayed. And the people who actually betrayed Zapata when they set him up for assassination in 1919, they're the ones who won the revolution, and their descendants are the ones that we're fighting today. So I really wanted to show how like the Mexican state terrorism and violence was the great generator of armed struggle. People made made the clear-eyed decision that the only way that they were going to get out of this was to use violence against this despotic state. And I really wanted to show like how that they were made and how they arrived at that decision. Now, so Lucio, when he fled up into the mountains, he only had like 3 or 4 supporters, right? And they, for a few years, they were going around and trying to convince people up in the mountains, hey, like join our revolutionary movement. And one of the things that Lucio writes about in a diary that was recovered by the Mexican military was that, people would, he would go into a community and we'd say, look, it's time to make a new revolution. And people would be like, all right, what's the general? Who's the general who's making the call for revolution? Which is like an early 20th century or 19th century mode of like uprising in Mexican history. You'd have a dissident general who would say on such and such date at such and such time, we're gonna organize and we're gonna like overthrow the government. And Lucio said, look, we have no generals, but what we do have is guerrilla warfare. And he had to convince people that was a more effective modality, that it was more effective to, as he said, live in the mountains, commune brutito, like a little animal, than it was to like confront head on the forces of the state. So Lucio had this idea that this was going to be it was prolonged popular war is essentially the idea that he had. And Lucio, even though he's, emerged from the Mexican Communist Party, he still was influenced by certain Maoist ideas. And I think one of those influences was shaped by his idea that the revolution was going to be a long delay process, and that this was going to take a really long time. And it was going to involve a lot of political organizing. But they didn't get a chance to do it, right? Because the Mexican state did send in like a third of their military by the late 60s, early 70s, and they waged a pretty horrific terror campaign that targeted not just the guerrilla per se, but that targeted their popular base of support. So they would do things like, force people who they would think were guerrilla supporters, they would force them to drink gasoline and then light them on fire and then throw their charred bodies outside of a community as a way to induce terror. The death flights and the disappearances were also meant to do the same, to induce terror, to rip up communal and social fabrics, to induce people into silence, to prevent them from even thinking about challenging the power of the Mexican state. So don't even, there's a famous case, one of the only cases of a disappeared person from Guerrero that actually made it to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights about 10 years ago was Rosendo Radilla. I had the great privilege of interviewing his daughter like in 2007, 2008. And she told me the story of how this guy, he had been a municipal president. He'd been like an open political activist. Like he wasn't living underground, but he did compose and sing corridos, ballads. And during the 70s, he would write and sing corridos about people like Lucio Cabañas, and he was taken off a bus. In front of it, he was on a bus with his 11-year-old son. So they got stopped at a checkpoint. Someone pointed him out and said he's a member of the guerrilla. The soldiers boarded the bus. They asked him, "Are you the one who sings those corridos?" And he said, "Yeah, is that a crime?" And the soldier responded with, "No, pero te chingaste de todos modos, like you're fucked anyway." And they took him, and then we've never seen him again. This was like August of 1974. And his 11-year-old son, we know this because he viewed all of it and he listened and he heard everything. And him and his siblings, like Tita Radilla, the daughter that I talked to, have been waging decades-long struggle to find out, what happened to their father, right? So it took a massive amount of terror to disarticulate the connections that this guerrilla movement had with their base of popular support. It also included things like align with like local narco traffickers, so the military would ally with local narcos, and they would work together to take out, to target communities that were deemed to support the Partido de los Pobres, or to take out the guerrilla when they were camped out up in the mountains of Guerrero.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just to say, like, anecdotally, when I went to post this on Instagram, I always look for music, and there are a ton of corridos for Lucio Cabañas. And so that is to the question kind of earlier of like, why isn't it in like public schools or whatever? Like this is actually one of the ways in which the legacy is remembered and memorialized too. And also makes me think of what Che Rodriguez that we had on like a year ago, and he did something on Oscar Grant and he called it a hyphy corrido. He was thinking about his work in that vein, but I kind of wanted to continue just a little bit on that topic, because you just talked a little bit about like kind of the terror campaigns, right? Or these like, what people would call counterterrorism, which I always think is a weird term because it really means like state terror to go after these movements, but you a lot of what you're looking at is the PRI legacy of this, right? And I think that's really interesting for the reasons that we've already talked about, in terms of like they have these kind of positionings, a self-identification with kind of revolutionary, ideology, even the relationship with Cuba, right? And it's interesting. I mean, I think that this is like, it is one of the contradictions of taking state power also, is that like, once you are in power, you are going to engage in forms of counterinsurgency. And so then it also doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think, from my perspective, that in every instance that's is sort of incorrect, right? It's like, that's just the nature of state power to a certain extent. You're going to have different forces that challenge you through that. And you have these different tactics that you're using to try to break up these movements, or so obviously most of the examples we study here on millennials are ones I would consider profoundly negative, right? Because we're talking about imperialist countries doing this, we're talking about reactionary fascist forms of this, but it is also something that obviously, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela or, the USSR or China, that they also wrestled with during, periods of, a communist or socialist state project, right? And so there's some interesting, I think, nuance there. And I think, part of where I wanted to take it from there is like kind of bringing it a little bit to the present and thinking about something like, AMLO and Morena, this is a movement in some ways that has a very kind of popular base. It has a worker, led base. And as my understanding, in some ways, like early stages of it, we could think of it as somewhat insurgent against the PRI, not necessarily, not guerrilla, peasant guerrilla movement, right? But, contesting elections sometimes, saying that, there was fraud and things like that, and challenging the state and the PRI in certain ways, and using some of those tactics of challenging also to build their own popular support and mobilizations. And now, we have it as a party in power too. So it's like interesting too to think about that in terms of something David brought up earlier with like the Zapatistas and whatnot.
Mhm.
Of, I think maybe one of the reasons we could say that there's a little bit less international interest in the Zapatistas might also be that a lot of people are kind of interested in Morena, or interested in what Mexico is doing as a kind of, in terms of a sort of progressive project, and that then things that are seen as, like maybe the Zapatistas are seen as sort of ultra, right, or fringe to this in this moment, and so I don't know exactly where my question is there, but it's just sort of thinking about this broader kind of challenge of, especially when you're talking about a government that is sort of progressive, but maybe not really truly revolutionary, and how do forces that then want a more revolutionary politic try to engage with, those kind of state projects, and what are the challenges they face?
Yeah, no, that's good, man. Especially because one of the accusations that members of the Mexican opposition have launched towards López Obrador and his government is that he's kind of like a Luis Echeverría 2.0. So, which is, I think, it's inaccurate. Luis Echeverría being the president of Mexico from 1970 to 1976, that really was at that, who ordered this terrorism campaign against multiple social movements like the one in Guerrero. So I would say one of the interesting things about Morena is that it emerges from social movements, right? As a political party, it's like a conglomeration of different social movements with different trajectories from different legacies of particularly like nonviolent, nonviolent social movements who at different moments have challenged both the PRI and then the right-wing PAN that won elections in 2000 and were in power until 2012. One of the threads that fed into Morena comes from the PRD, which was a party of the Democratic Revolution that gets kind of founded in the late 80s by the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, right? Lázaro Cárdenas being Mexico's most, I guess, leftist populist president who was in power in the 1930s. He's kind of seen as the guy who finally materialized some of the more radical legacies of the Mexican Revolution, like mass agrarian reform and doing things like nationalizing Mexican oil. Well, his son challenges a PRI in the late 80s. He stands for election in 1988 as part of what was it called? It wasn't called the PRD yet, but it was something like the FDR, like a front. It was like a front organization that then became a political party. And it's pretty much accepted that the PRI stole that election. That when they were counting the votes, a guy by the name of Manuel Bartlett said, "El sistema se cayó," like the computer system like failed. And then when they turned it back on, all of a sudden the neoliberal PRI candidate Salinas de Gortari was ahead. The irony is that guy Bartlett is now like part of Morena, right? So it's just crazy. But the PRD activists in Guerrero in the late 80s and early 90s, like hundreds of them were killed, right, by an assortment of different forces on the ground, usually, PRI affiliated paramilitaries or politicians or narcos or whatever. And so they're like one trajectory that then goes on to feed something called Morena once López Obrador leaves the PRD in the 2010s to create to transform a social movement into a political party that now has won 2 presidential elections in like overwhelming fashion. It's also interesting to think about when we break it down by scale, right? So, and this is something that we have to do to understand Mexico in the 70s, right? So if we look at Mexico in the 1970s from an international perspective, it looks like a progressive, non-interventionist, a government that's generally on the good side of things, right? But then once you start like kind of picking at it by scale and you go to the regional and the local, it's a radically different perspective that we get, right? And this is what that's what I had to do personally when I started doing research, when I started researching and writing the Party of the Poor, and to think about what was going on in Guerrero in the 60s and 70s. that contradicted what the PRI was saying about itself at the national and at the international level. And that's, to me, it's a reminder to think about like the multi-scalar approach that we need to analyze these type of dynamics today. And it's, you know, to see also, to pay attention to, you know, one of the things that was really useful for my research was to look at like US declassified documents and how they were talking about the guerrilla movement, the Party of the Poor, and how they were talking about Lucio. And that gives you a hint too, right? Like in terms of like where this group stands, what they're against, what they're trying to do. And they were pretty clear about what this guy was and what he represented. This was like a communist guerrilla movement that was trying to overthrow the PRI, even though the PRI officials were telling the Americans, oh, don't worry about it. There's no guerrillas. They're all a bunch of cattle rustlers. And the Americans knew better. There was one testimony where people said that the Americans were helping the Mexican military take out the Party of the Poor in the 70s because they said, I'm trying to remember the source of this, but these locals alleged that there were American boots on the ground because these were Puerto Ricans who spoke Spanish in a different way. And that was evidence to them that the US was helping the Mexican military take out the guerrilla poor. No way that's possible. I refuse to believe that. They spoke a different Spanish because they were norteños. They were from like Mexican military units that were transferred from northern Mexico down into Guerrero because the Mexican military thought that locally stationed groups might actually defect and join the guerrillas. And we do have some individual cases of that. I guess that's how I approach or answer your question, Jay. I think that taking a multi-scalar approach to look at some of these dynamics is really important. There's been a vigorous debate on the Mexican left since AMLO took power in 2018. And it, you know, obviously it's social media, so it gets pretty nasty online. And you'll say, you know, the AMLO supporters will say, oh, like the so-called true revolutionaries, the Zapatistas, are actually working to undercut or undermine a progressive government at the national level. But if anything, what these guerrilla movements represent is that something's wrong, something's rotten. Like these people emerge from something, right? So what is it that produced guerrilla movements in Guerrero in the 1970s? What is it that about Guerrero that continues to produce guerrilla movements, right? Like they've been pretty silent for like the last 10 years. But when the Ayotzinapa thing happened in 2014, different groups were releasing communiques like vowing vengeance against the Mexican state. So there's probably still folks up there, right? If there's a guerrillas, that testifies to a failure of a particular state project. And that's the Zapatistas' ability to survive, to persist, to reorganize, to reproduce themselves generationally. I think that testifies to something that continues to be rotten or wrong within this particular state and particular state form. And if you've been following the news, like what's been happening in Chiapas since last year is horrific, right? You have Mexican Chiapas communities fleeing to Guatemala because of the violence that's emerged from, you know, between different narco trafficking organizations that are trying to take control of particularly the border region of Chiapas with Guatemala. So even like within this horrific context, and the Zapatistas have had to adapt and they've had to reorganize. And last year, I think it was last year, earlier this year, where they announced like a pretty thorough reorganization of their community base of support. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that these narco groups have infiltrated the region and they're waging war against one another, and they're displacing entire communities, and they're killing a lot of people, right? So what does that say then about the government at the national level? What does that say about what continues to be wrong within the way that like political power, economic power, and social power is currently configured in Mexico, regardless of whether the government is self-identifies as progressive or you know the type of right wing represented by the PAN. The interesting thing in the Mexican case is like all these other political, parliamentary or official political forces have completely like exhausted themselves. And now you just have Morena, which is really interesting to see as well. Like the Mexican opposition is spent, it's exhausted, it has no pull. And you have them whining a lot on social media and in telecommunications, but it's pretty obvious that they have very little support, and Morena has the support. The question then is, okay, so how is Morena going to interface with local groups, with progressive radical groups on the ground who are fighting against Canadian mining companies in a place like Oaxaca or Veracruz or Guerrero, who are fighting to prevent hydroelectric projects from being built in Guerrero? How are you going to interface with, environmental activists who are trying to prevent contamination of water sources in a place like Sonora? Like, these are like open questions, right? And how this progressive, self-identified progressive government is going to deal with that is going to say a lot about what type of government this is.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I think the those points, the scalar way of looking at it, right? The looking at Morena and its actual connection, or the how it looks at the state level or then at a national level versus these particular struggles that continue to happen, whether like all the ones you're naming, a lot of the flack and rightful criticism of how the Tren Maya project is going,
Mhm.
the increase in of military maneuvers or military bases, like the new kind of like national airport system that AMLO brought, right, is now connecting into Chiapas in particular. I think right from Mexico's state, Estado de Mexico into Chiapas and into the Yucatan. So I think this is I think you're right on with that there is still there's all this there's still a lot that Morena has to do. And we'll see what with Sheinbaum, how the next 6 years look with her at the head of the party, or how I think you mentioned in your last talk with Jay, right, that the party itself, there's a lot of like internal struggles. Sure, they're trying to figure things out. What direction are they headed? And I think that kind of gets me to kind of think of another question around the relationship between Mexico. I mean, you talked a little bit about this with Jay before, but I kind of want to bring it up here just to give some more space on to it, because it's an election season right now of Morena's relationship, or the Mexico's relationship to the U.S. And with the current unfortunate excitement by the left, or the so-called left in the U.S., for having a neoliberal like take the reins of the empire again, with a neoliberal running mate as well. That right now what I'm wondering and what I'm thinking is like how, especially because there's there's so many. I think it's already the United Farm Workers and De Los Huerta have already like put their money and their stamp on Harris, which was
they've done that a long time.
Yeah, I was going to say it's nothing. It's not exciting.
Yeah.
It's not like something like, oh my gosh, it should be a shock. It's like, oh, of course, right? Is where it's going to go. But then even some of the I would say some of the other folks who were very much like pushing the like the Fuera Trump movement in the US, it was small, but it did happen, are now like either silent or really didn't criticize Biden, I don't think, as much as we should have. And there was no Fuera Biden, and I was surprised that we didn't see that for how he handled the border, with was it Special Order 14, or the inability for people to seek asylum, or those types of things. But yeah, like things like the influence of things like Plan Merida on the effects of in Mexico right now, and the relationship to Morena, right? That the U.S. is still has this has like this 4-pillar system. I was looking at the Plan Merida website right now, and they're trying to move away from that, but it's all around this idea of security, financial investment, financializing, getting the financial literacy of Latin America.
Nearshoring. That's the big one.
Nearshoring. Yeah. And that is what Harris's plan is, right? Harris, when she spoke about, what her plan was for Central America was don't come, but then also let's get GAP and Visa into Central America as a panacea to help people from not coming. Just get, put more of the Wall Street into Central America, something that really worked out really well in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
She's like, let's bring more United Fruit Company into Central America.
That's what I was like, a United Fruit Company redo, So
same logic.
and I think there's just so much confusion on not so much, but there's an intentional confusion or intentional forgetting about the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. And this kind of gets lost in the sauce of you having so many people who are, I would say, the nationalism within, within Mexicanos that live here is very strong, as it is in Mexico, and regional nationalism too, and cultural nationalism, as you were mentioning before. But I feel it being like it's not kind of clicking. It's being very uncritical of what the politics are, or at least the popular discourse is very much aligning very strongly with, again, with the Democratic Party, which is not surprising, but there's just I just kind of see these dynamics playing out again, and what is gonna basically kick our ass into motion to be thinking more critically about not aligning ourselves with people who want to do harm and continue the underdevelopment and the counterinsurgency in Mexico, right? Keeping the narcos going with, the CIA connections that have had, multiple years of, being there, and I don't know. There's just so much. There's a lot there that I'm wondering what your thoughts are on any
Honestly,
of
I
it, or
think,
what you think it is.
yeah, no, honestly, I think it would take a Trump victory. I mean, that's the only, like, because Jay, you've talked about this, right? Like the political function of the Democratic Party is like, it's counterinsurgent in nature, right? Like, so the Democrats win and we're supposed to shut up, right? And then we just saw this with Kamala Harris at that rally in Detroit, with the shit she pulled on the protesters, on they're asking to end the genocide in Gaza. Like, well, what did we get? We got, girl boss, and people are like, yeah, like that's the way you're supposed to react. And someone brought it on, I can't remember who was on Twitter, brought up the really good point that when Obama ran the second term, the Dreamers were, all over his ass, like protesting him, because that's democracy, right? Like, democracy is popular pressure from below, not just voting every 4 years, which is what they would want, right? Like, it's organizing and political and grassroots pressure from below to get them to do what we want them to do. That's just part of being a democracy. But the Democrats feel like when they're in power, they shouldn't be subject to that. And this is what they've had issues with in confronting, the movements of folks in the US who want a genocide to end, and they refuse to do it. And as we talked about with Jay last time, right, this is a similar issue with like quote unquote border security policy and anti-migration, anti-asylum seeker policy at the border as well. We're not supposed to protest that as well. And you have, Latinx groups who are just appendages of the Democratic Party, right? Like Cesar Chavez's granddaughter worked for Biden, worked for Obama, worked for Biden. Now she's working for Kamala Harris, and they roll out Por Dolores Huerta every 4 years. I want to be nice about this. They roll her out every 4 years to say, vote Democrat, vote for the Democratic Party. And then we don't see her again. And I think that's like elder abuse, but whatever. That's a different story. So when do these Democrats act differently when it comes to something like migration and the border? When they lose. And then they're going to go to the border and they're going to cry and they're going to put on this whole show like AOC did, or like Kamala did in 2018, where she's saying no human is illegal. Like, honestly, for those issues and for certain US empire policy, the worst thing that happened is when Democrats win, because then they expect not to be challenged by their base. And when they are challenged by their own base, they don't like it. But that's supposedly, based on your definition of democracy, that's what democracy is supposed to be about. So it happens, man. I'm old, so I've seen this happen over and over again, where as soon as the Democrat wins, all the people who are organizing for, migrant rights, migrant activism, et cetera, especially organizations, they become really silent, or they just go opted in and they work for these different administrations or for different politicians. And that kind of diffuses some of the anger and the willingness from below to organize and to mobilize in defense of migrant rights, in defense of asylum seeker rights, in defense of refugee rights, in defense of Palestinian rights. Obviously I don't want Trump to win for a variety of reasons, but to answer your question, what would get these Democrats to change? I mean, for a lot of things, I think they're bipartisan anyway, so it doesn't matter. But when you get them to change a little bit, at least their tone, at least at least they'll go to the border and cry for us a little bit to get on camera, is for them to lose. And then all of a sudden they find their courage. All of a sudden they find, their the no one is illegal sign. And remember those lawn signs that said like, in this house we believe in, and then they those signs like disappear when Democrats are in power. They only pop up when the Republicans are in power. And especially, because of Trump, because supposedly Trump represents some sort of abnormality. But as someone who grew up in California in the 80s and 90s, to me, he's just like a Pete Wilson rehash, but with a little less polished version, a little bit more brash. But yeah, I mean, I think that's like the only, I think from my perspective, and I don't, again, to reiterate, I don't want to get like emails and like messages from people. I don't want Trump to win. I don't want to see mass deportations happen, because the fact that he's citing the Operation Wetback from the early 50s as a model, I think that's frightening. And I think he will do it, because he usually does. I mean, I think he will do it, because that's honestly the only thing he has left in his campaign. That's what's giving him, that's the fuel of his campaign. And honestly, I think the whole anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican sentiment of his first campaign was what allowed him to win. So, and it helped then. So, I worry about that. I worry about family members who are going to suffer the consequences of that. So the question then is, okay, so how do we get the Democrats, when they're empowered, to change, to do what we want them to do? And I don't see a way out of it, because we get things like what Kamala Harris did yesterday, which is, I think, like inexcusable. Sorry, Jay, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you finished. And I just wanted to say sort of a point of agreement, but also I think it's maybe reframe it a little bit, right? Because I think that the thing is, for me, I mean, obviously what Kamala did yesterday is abhorrent. And at the same time, on some level, I appreciate it because it's clear, right? She's just like, I don't, you people, like, supposedly they had met previously, right? And these are folks who are organizing for a weapons embargo, right? That's what they're saying. Mm-hmm. They're saying, stop arming Israel, right? Ceasefire is ultimately meaningless, because what ceasefire means when Kamala Harris or Joe Biden say it is that we want the Palestinian resistance to put down their arms and surrender, and then just take on, on faith that Israel and the United States have their best interests at heart, and we'll go from there, right? And obviously that's a non-starter for Palestinian folks, right? And so the I just appreciate in some ways the being clear of like, hey, this is our thing. Like we and the problem then becomes that the crowd cheers for her when she says that people then identify with this, like, yes, this is the mom stare, the auntie stare, whatever, of somebody who, this is how you confront people when they're not letting you talk or they're not being polite or whatever. And it's like, no, like there's a genocide going on. Like this is not a time for like vibes and these shallow identifications. Like, and so, I mean, I think to the point you make about the dreamers, Alex, is a really good one, right? Of saying like, when movements get serious, they recognize that you're going to have to organize against whoever wins. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that, I mean, people can argue you're always playing defense under Trump, right? And I think that that's true, but it becomes defense in which a lot of people actually join in the struggle. And then when the quote unquote, when the Democrats are in power, you're still playing defense, but there are fewer people who are willing to participate in it, and so I just wanted to say I kind of agree, although again that's not an endorsement of Trump at all. I think Trump's I think both will be horrible is the point. And we can argue that I think there's ample reasons to think that Trump would be worse, but part of the question to me is like, then what is the dialectic that gets people like actually struggling against the reality that's going to be really bad in either situation?
I'm really surprised, because I remember back in I'm from California too. I'm from Orange County, actually, from Santana and La Habra. And I remember, a place where the Minutemen Project, Jim Gilchrist, pretty much started that shit in Newport Beach. And I remember, um, people were more willing, I feel, too, in like 2010, 2000, especially when SB 1070 happened in Arizona. I mean, that's not news to you, having, teaching there. And there was a lot of people who probably voted for Obama that went and protested and were confronting. There was all this confrontations. There were shutting down of ICE centers or like trying to stop buses from leaving. Like people did a lot of stuff, and the fervor or the energy that was done during that Democratic presidency. Not to say that was like widespread, but it did happen. The 4 years of Biden has been pretty silent. I think other than statements maybe online or direct letters to him, I have not seen that same fervor by some of those same folks. And I think it speaks to the kind of an uncritical analysis of what Trump is and what Trump represents, of being this anomaly, right? I think you said it, Alex, too. Like if he's an anomaly, or that's the way we see him, then we have, then my criticism has to take a back seat to the Democratic Party of what I'm seeing happen, right? Because I cannot have this anomaly come back because of the legitimate fear that people have, the actual legitimate impact of people being impacted by the policies, as well as the increase of proto-fascist discourse and action and folks that are animated by what he says, but he doesn't, whether he's president or not, they're animated by what he says. So but yeah, I think this, I'm just so surprised, or like, I'm that it's come out this way. There's so much grandstanding for the Harris campaign right now, among folks who I think were very critical of Obama and now have kind of, I think, just taking a backseat on their analysis of what's actually happening here. And yeah, with what I didn't see what happened in the news yesterday, so I'm just kind of looking it up too, and like, damn, like that is so bad. That is supposed to be the one that's like that's supposed to be the victory for some certain leftist magazines and leftist groups on social media, saying yes, we got Waltz on there, like thank us for having this, and look at what they're this president's doing is or this potential president, this presidential candidate, this VP currently is doing to folks who are demanding an end to genocide, is to it's my turn to talk, right? How is that any different than Trump, the people that protested Trump rallies back into 2016? It's like the same playbook, and we need, and yeah, I think you're right, Jay. People just need to be honest. I think people need to be okay with saying, you know what, neoliberalism is more comfortable for me than the proto-fascist, like extreme neoliberalism of Trump's campaign. Like I'm okay with democratic neoliberalism, but I think people need, I don't know, I just think people need to be more honest about their decision making, because that's what I see is kind of happening, is that people are feeling more comfortable with that and willing to accept this terror, not only this behavior here, but the continual support of Israel and the bombing of Palestine, which is currently happening under her vice presidency and would continue, I think, under her presidency, really. I don't know. So
yeah, right on.
Yeah.
I just want to pull back to, there's a lot of good questions in the chat today too, back to kind of the earlier part of the conversation, and maybe we can pull up a couple of those, and then David, if you had anything else you wanted to get to, we can add that too. But Aria asked this question about speaking to the Mexican conception of these commune revolutionary ideologies in relation to conceptions of race, Indigenous, Spanish, etc. And how do you define Chicano, and how does that relate in your view?
I'm not going to attempt to define Chicano. David, you're going to have to step up for that one, man. That's a really important question. I mean, I think the question of race and indigeneity is a really important one. So one of the points of critique for some of the armed revolutionary movements that emerged in Mexico in the 60s and 70s is that particularly the ones who are more openly like doctrinaire, like Marxists, was that they negated the question of race and indigeneity, and obviously, and then viewing gender as like a secondary contradiction, because all these movements had guerrilleras as well, including Lucio's movement that had at least 24, maybe more. So in Lucio's movement, it was, you have people from coastal Guerrero that are, it's really interesting because how they define themselves racially is interesting, because they tend to define themselves against more like indigenous communities that are like clearly indigenous communities in other parts of Guerrero, right? Particularly in a part like that's called La Montaña, which is southern Guerrero. And a lot of these, a lot of agricultural day laborers would come from that area to the mountains in coastal Guerrero, where to work on like coffee ejidos or things like that. So Lucio doesn't really like he doesn't directly engage the question of indigeneity as like a central component of this revolutionary movement, but you do have like a central core of his demand for the movement is like rights for all indigenous peoples in Mexico. He also, in his diary, his incomplete diary that we have now because of the Mexican military, he was writing entries in Nahuatl, because his plan was to spread the guerrilla movements to those Nahuatl speaking parts of Guerrero. So, my response to these like historiographical critiques of this generation of Mexican revolutionary movements is like, yeah, you're right. Most of them were, particularly the urban ones, focused on class, and they focused on the cities, and they viewed, the question of campesino identity, racial identity, indigeneity, gender. They tended to view those as like secondary or non-important contradictions. I actually see that the Party of the Poor as anticipating what happens with the EZLN in the 90s, where indigeneity is at the forefront of this revolutionary movement, that the indigenous person in southern Mexico is, in Marcos's writings, like they're not even basement Mexico, like they're below the basement, right? Like if you think of like Mexico as a house, like he says, the indigenous people are below, like they are the most exploited, they are the most oppressed, they are the most poor, the most impoverished, the least able to access like basic nutritional needs. The fact that Lucio was talking about indigeneity in that way in the 70s, I think kind of signaled a shift that then will take place in other Latin American revolutionary movements in the 70s and the 80s, in places like Guatemala, especially, where you have guerrilla movements that began as more doctrinaire, like left Marxist, where their left Marxist analysis of why they were trying to overthrow their military dictatorship. And then once they're in indigenous areas in Guatemala, they're like, wait a minute, this makes our revolutionary ideology actually makes no sense. The protagonist cannot be the proletariat or a vague definition of peasant. Like the protagonist has to be the indigenous person in Guatemala. So yeah, that's how I see these conceptions of race begin in Mexico, not just in Mexico in the 1960s and 70s, but also within revolutionary movements in other parts of Latin America that then will start to, at the very least, adopt a more heterodox position when it comes to defining revolutionary protagonists, and to do what Fanon asked us to do, which was to stretch in a colonial context. We have to stretch Marxism a little bit. These guerrilleros who were up in the mountains or out in the countryside, they were forced to do the same thing, whether it was Lucio Guerrero or whether it was the army of the poor in Guatemala in the mid to late 1970s.
Yeah. To define Chicano, I'm not gonna. Yeah. So what I'll say is that, yeah, I think it's there's so many different versions of it, and that's I think it just depends where you talk. What part of the historiography you look at. So the way. Because some people's, in the 60s, some groups were a lot more popular, saying, Chicanos are people of Mexican descent that live in the States, that live in the Southwest in particular. Mm-hmm. Other folks looked at it, said, yeah, it's just folks from the Southwest, but we're actually culturally or ethnically Mexicanos. We need to there was this like really cool picture of, I think it's Casa, that has an image of somebody wearing like I'm a Chicano shirt, and then in the mirror it says, yo soy Mexicano, or I'm Mexican. Mm-hmm. Saying like there's not this real difference. It's like so then it means, well, what is Mexicano? Well, it's a multi-ethnic or pluriethnico, I think is the way the Constitution says it now, society, right, made up of a vast majority of indigenous people or people of indigenous descent, but also currently a large amount of indigenous people. And these are the folks that, Chicanos identify with or come directly connect with, or these are these same people. But also in Guerrero, perfect example, Costa Chica, historically Afro-Mexicano community,
Mhm.
along with Oaxaca. And not only there, but throughout Mexico, in particular, the mining histories of Mexico, Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, other places. Um, and yeah, and that's we look at, if Chicano is, I would say it would be better situated thinking about the 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 pluriethnic histories of Mexico, but it's been largely focused though on indigenous Mexico, but in a way that unfortunately I think sometimes looks only at, um I think other authors have said, like the dead Indian. You look at you look at um you study Nahuatl that's not spoken by anyone today. You don't talk about Nahuatl from the Huasteca, or it's really looking at Nahuatl speakers and Nahuatl culture, Mexica culture from the past, as opposed to looking at the multitude, the 62, I think is nationally recognized indigenous nations
Yeah.
of Mexico, let alone all the language groups and the way people identify themselves being a lot larger. Um, but all those folks not just having that one identity, as Alex was saying, right? These are, as Lucio Cabañas was trying to, and others, right, studying Nahuatl, writing in Nahuatl, seeing and understand the figure of of the revolution, the revolutionary vanguard, or what a revolutionary peasant was. Well, it's deeply tied to this idea of indigeneity of land, and this, I think, Alex, you write about it really well. This history of uh you call it pobrista socialism, right? There's if there's a way to describe what was happening in Mexico at the time in the 70s, or maybe what's still the way socialism looks like in Mexico, um, is this type that is from pobrismo or pobrista, this idea of an ideology or a pedagogy, or sorry, a praxis of looking at the idea of poverty and the way it impacts the particular indigenous, but also just particular rural communities of Mexico. And I want to know if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, and kind of like adding to this question or your response here on the type of the role of international struggle and solidarity for the idea of like the pobrista politic or pobrista socialism, or how you frame it. I know I'm just kind of throwing this into our conversation, but I know you write about it, pobrismo and pobrista being a really important part of looking at um, revolutionary consciousness in Mexico, or the particular type of the commune or la comuna mexicana. Um,
Yeah, I think so. It's the idea of el pobre, the poor, right? Like that in Lucio's revolutionary imagination, that's the revolutionary protagonist. It's a capacious definition of who constitutes the poor, right? Who is which particular individual or group of people within a particular social context uh, has to sell their labor to someone else, right? I mean, that's so he has a very like broad definition of who constitutes the poor, and it's a lot of this speaks to like a understanding of class in rural Mexico that goes back centuries, right? They don't talk about, obviously for many reasons, they don't talk about the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. They talk about the rich versus the poor. And in many cases, the rich have last names attached to them because this wealth and this power gets reproduced generationally. And when you talk about power, power has a face, power has a last name, and you know who you have to go hit, using Lucio's language. Like Lucio had a when he was up in the mountains, he had little patience for like long rambling theoretical like screeds on how to wage revolution. Like he said, they hit us and then we have to hit them back. Sometimes that's all the analysis you need. But this idea of understanding class conflict as the rich versus the poor, and creating the poor as the revolutionary protagonist that would wage a new revolution in Mexico to redeem past betrayed iterations of that revolution. So not even just talking about the campesino, but talking about the poor. So you could then bring in the urban working class. You could bring in other exploited sectors of Mexican society to form part of this broadly defined revolutionary protagonist. I think at its best, like the identity of Chicano has also served that historically, right? Like it's a pretty capacious term with that many can fit, right? And it mobilizes and it provides a lot of power. But Lucio also viewed this on a global scale. Like he talked about the rich versus the poor being like a global struggle. And he didn't really like bother with like Cold War binaries between like the West and the United States and the East, the Soviet Union, or he rarely even talked about the global South. He just saw it divided as the international revolutionary struggle between the poor and the rich. And that this little party of the poor in this little corner of Guerrero was part of this broader struggle. Some of that has, that framing is like, to me, shows like his roots as a rural school teacher. Like he's trying to explain to a population that's not schooled in like highfalutin Marxist theory, but they are schooled in how power works at the local level. And he has to understand that, and he has to speak their idiom, and then he has to present his definition of class struggle in a framing using the language that these local communities will understand. There's in my book, I talk about how he uses, he arrives at one community, I think it was in 73 or 74, and he's trying to explain like historical or dialectical materialism to this community. But he does it by talking about the life cycle of corn, right? And to talk about movement of time. And he's trying to convince people that, our lot in life is not predestined. Like, we need to struggle in this life. He doesn't use like the ideas of liberation theology explicitly, but it's a very like liberation theology approach to explaining class struggle and revolution to like religious communities. And then he extends this framing to the global scale, right? So for him, pobrista socialism was, what Marx talked about in his writings on the Paris Commune, right? He has that he starts his writings on the Paris Commune with that question: what is the commune, that sphinx so tantalizing to the bourgeois mind? That's the Paris Commune. That's the self-government of the producers. That's worker power. That's campesino power. They're the ones who get to run their everyday lives, and they have control over their everyday lives. Lucio would just, instead of calling them bourgeois, proletariat, or the producers, he says the poor. And I think, again, because he's trying to explain this, he's trying to make sense to local communities that understand class conflict in these terms. And then he's able to explain this global struggle during the 60s and 70s using the very same framing of class struggle.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down. Yeah. I think that's what I liked a lot about how you write about that, right? That this needed to be translated, right? I think that's and we talk about it. I think there's a lot of really, discussion on that on the left, or, the importance of breaking it down or saying it plain, as Malcolm X talked about, right? And Lucio gives a perfect example of that, right? The way in which that revolutionary consciousness or revolutionary fervor needs to be discussed and translated with people in their own terms, but not as and the way you're explaining, right? He's like, well, let me continue to have the complexity of my arguments or of what I'm saying, but based on these ideas that the community already knows, and they already have this sense of needing to get, revolutionary vengeance against the rich, right? What they've seen happen. And yeah, I think that's really great to kind of break that down.
And that's the role. Can I say something quick?
Yeah,
like that's the role
sure.
of the rural school teacher. Like that's why it's so important that he was a school teacher, and that he's not unique. Like the guy who helped Emiliano Zapata write his famous Plana Bayala Revolutionary Manifesto was a school teacher, a rural school teacher. So the rural school teachers in 20th century Mexico have served as political translators, right? And they're an example of what Lucio talks about when he says, to be a revolutionary, you have to be of the people, for the people, and from the people. Like you have to be embedded in these communities to understand the political desires and dreams and past of these communities. In the Mexican independence movement, it was priests. Why? Because there were no school teachers. Actually, priests were the ones who provided some of the minimal education that existed in the last part of the Spanish control over Mexico. So it's no surprise then that two of the first independence heroes in Mexican history were also priests, right? Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos. So it's a really, to me, in the book I just referred, they're translators, they're political translators, but they're also like Gramscian organic intellectuals because they're from these communities. And Lucio had a very contentious relationship with outside, especially urban guerrillas, who would come up to the mountains and pretend and act like they were going to teach these these poor campesinos on how to appropriately wage a revolution. And Lucio would be like, we've been doing this for 7 years. How long have you guys been doing this? And then there's an instance where these Marxist urban guerrilleros would show up into the mountains and give like seminars. And one guy was giving a seminar on like a Marxist definition of the state, gives this whole long thing about like the Marxist definition of the state. And then he asks questions like, did you guys understand what I said? And he's like, so what's the state? And he points to one guy, and the guy responds with, well, the state is the miserable state that we find ourselves in today. Like, it's just like the inability for a highly educated urban Mexican Marxist guerrilla in trying to connect with these campesinos up in the mountains of Guerrero, like, to me, is it really encapsulated in this anecdote. And that's why someone like Lucio is so important. And rural school teachers have been and continue to be so important in Mexico as political translators and organizers. Sorry for the interruption, David.
No, right on. No, and I just wanted, just to kind of connect that back to the question of Chicano. I think that's, when we study Chicano, the Chicano movement, I think there is those organic intellectual, the role of priests or churches, and also of teachers, especially in East Los Angeles, that struggle in LA. There's a lot of those connections that the people from the community themselves are, well, I mean, obviously in a different context and also very different analysis of what was happening. I mean, not super different, but a different analysis, not revolutionary, communism or like communism or socialism like that exclusively. But I think there is that, like, there is these lessons and these threads that do connect the Chicano movement, formation of the Chicano movement in the 60s, as you were mentioning before, and what's happening in Mexico in the 60s as well, with the in particular with the guerrilla movement. It's going to take a historian to help us connect more of these things, right? More of these connections, which I think I'm looking forward to that when that does come out. If there is one of the things that you do say, though, on not only Lucio, but and the Partido de los Pobres, like, not being what happens to the vendor, as Jay mentioned, right, of someone bringing up or selling that, what happens, they get confronted by the government, or there's these different things. But one of the things that you also say in your writing is that as a whole, the Mexican guerrilla left, like, during the 60s, was kind of more isolated than other Latin American guerrilla movements. I don't know if you can speak on why that, what were some of the reasons for that, or also maybe some of the consequences of that disconnection, even though you did give some examples, right? There was people, looking at those writings or reading the communiques for the Black Panther Party, printing, writings of, or at least mentioning Lucio Cabañas and things like that. But yeah, you do say that it was isolated overall if we look at it in comparison. And I don't know if you can just speak on why that was, or any consequences you think that came out of that.
I mean, when the big consequence was their defeat. I think part of the broader approach of the PRI was to corral these different guerrilla groups in their local theater of operation to prevent them from interfacing with nonviolent social movements, and especially to prevent them from coordinating at the regional, national, and international level. So the PRI counterinsurgency in a place like Guerrero was to really corral and to confine this group to their particular part of Guerrero, even though the group did make efforts to create cells in other parts of the country. They, by and large, were unsuccessful, and they got wiped out pretty quickly. But as I mentioned earlier, the reason why is because I think, and this is an ongoing question that the historians are working on, but for me, one of the big reasons is the way that the PRI was seen by international, by other leftist governments and by international leftist organizations. So again, the fact that the PRI had this identity as a progressive, revolutionary, nationalist government that internationally did things like, be a advocate for non-intervention and to seemingly push back against U.S. intervention in Latin America, when in reality, in secret channels, they were all for it. That I think did a lot to delegitimize these different movements. There's an infamous incident in 1972 when Chilean President Salvador Allende visits Mexico and hangs out with Lucio Cabañas, and then he goes to a university, I think it was a university in Guadalajara, and he chastises the students for protesting Echeverria, the guy who most likely ordered the 1968 student massacre and then another student massacre in 1971, right? So the PRI had the vocal support of people like Allende, people like Fidel Castro. They were accepting, Uruguayan, Brazilian, and Argentine exiles who had to flee their countries because of military dictatorships. In the late 70s and 80s, they accepted Central American refugees for the same reason. So the PRI had pretty strong position internationally in terms of its image, its self-fashioned image that it took great care to fashion and to project, while internally it was waging a war of extermination against the armed left. It also was really good at kind of splitting the left, and especially Echeverria. So there was a domesticated left, the good left, that kind of went along with this program. Echeverria basically said, look, if you guys don't support me, then fascism is going to win, and we're going to have some sort of takeover like in other parts of Latin America. And I think some of the more famous leftists bought that. They bought that it was either Echeverria or fascismo, as it was the slogan. So the PRI was always really good at splitting the left, co-opting certain segments of the left, buying off the left with their resources, and then leaving the most radical sectors, vulnerable to wars of extermination. So yeah, I mean, that's the way the Echeverria or fascismo framing of it, I think was an effective way internally to delegitimize the armed left.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I think that leaves us, so much more in terms of interrogating the archive of, the Mexican guerrilla left for for historians. But I when you do a search, especially when you do a search in Spanish, so much comes up. There's a lot of really good stuff. So which is great to see.
It's great. We're getting there. It's been a lot. It's a lot more than when I came across this random reference to Lucio as an undergraduate doing a paper on the 68 student movement. Or, I mean, the one other really popular reference in the late 90s, I guess, when did this movie Amores Perros came out in the late 90s, early 2000, or maybe 2000. And one of the characters was a former guerrilla who then, part of his story in the movie is to say that he was the repentant guerrilla who ruined his life by trying to take down the Mexican government. And he was so repentant and he was wrong, and it cost him his family. And he became this amoral assassin for the Mexican police. So that was that image of the Mexican guerrilla left, I think was stuck for a little bit. So it's been really, for me, since that movie and since other things, more cultural productions that happened in Mexico in the 80s and 90s. For me, it's been really gratifying to see the amount of research and information that has come out. But the Mexican state continues to do their tricks to restrict access to archives and to disappear archival collections, et cetera, et cetera. But we do have a lot more, and it's really gratifying. And I agree. I think it's a really important thing that we must continue to research and interrogate.
That's awesome. It reminds me, we should have a Blue Beetle conversation night, David.
I'm definitely down. As I said, that's the only film in all of the ones that I've seen that use the word imperialism. Everyone else calls it colonizing, but they use the I word. So they're, we could talk about it. But yeah. Also too, one of their co-stars is hardcore, was on that Dads or Latino Males for Kamala. That was George Lopez. He's so there's a lot to talk about with that movie.
Okay, for the record, I was not on that call, so no one accused me of being on the Latino Males for Kamala call. That
oh my gosh, that was you're better for it, Alex. You're better for it. Yeah.
Yeah. David and one of our friends in the chat infiltrated that call to do counter surveillance. So
good. Thank you for taking one for the team, man.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Um, all right, I think we'll wrap it there. Thanks everybody for this. Great questions. We didn't get to totally everything, but from the maybe we could do this one quickly. Actually, is kind of closing. And David, maybe you could say a little bit to this. Is someone asked, if you believe that minority studies, Chicano, Central American, Asian studies, Black studies, we could throw in there, are important to learn the history and identity of these communities. So I think it's kind of something that you two have kind of teased and hinted at a little bit in this conversation of, what is your relationship to these things and how you think about them.
Yeah, I'll go first, and I'll let Alex, the senior scholar and senior professor here, have the last word here. I've been really more thinking about this a lot because I was, what brought me into a lot of these politics was, well, the time it was 2006. It was the mega marchas that were happening to stop HR 4437, which would have made it a felony to be undocumented in the U.S.
Mhm.
and you'd be harboring a felon if one of your loved ones in your house was a undocumented person. And I took my first Chicano studies class at that time too, and it really brought me into these politics and looking at questions around imperialism, U.S. empire, and things like that. But I think I think they are important because they do have that initial hook, I think, into thinking about these questions and questioning. Um, Colonialism, settler colonialism, capitalism, empire, and things like that, to learn these histories. But I think it's also, as Alex said earlier, because it's been captured by the state, and I think other people. I was really looking at this book recently. It was called Third World Studies: Theorizing Liberation by Gary Okihiro, and he has a really awesome argument. I really like his argument to say that third world studies is what people demanded, but what we got was ethnic studies. What we got was minority studies. And I'm a professor of ethnic studies, so this is a self-criticism to me. Um, is that yeah, it can lead folks, I think, to study to grab these and hook onto these things, but it's not a guarantee. It's honestly like a lot of the way I feel that since it's been captured by the academy, a lot of it is to take out the Marxist and socialist kind of underpinnings, roots, the questions of that or the entanglements of that, to have a more kind of like fairy tale way of like, well, when we got to the 60s, we finally got there. Now we have prosecutors who are Mexican or Chicanos. Like that's great, in California or whatever the cost, whatever. So now we're just looking really obsessed with population. Now we have a majority in these counties or these things. Like look
In the Border Patrol.
yeah, in the Border Patrol, Jesus,
Yeah.
yeah. Like I see, jole, like damn, is the in LAPD también, like right here in LA, or the sheriff's department también, like right here in LA, we're in SoCal. But yeah, so I think it's good. It can be good. I just think the way it needs to be. It really depends on the professor who's teaching it or their training. Because as a field, I think that it's been captured a lot, and I think there's people that are trying to carve out critical ethnic studies. To look at Black studies, Chicano, Chicanx, or Latina studies, Asian American studies, and Indigenous studies. There's plenty of scholars who are doing that work. I would say though they're not in the majority, and they're not the ones. And also to the way the academy, even if you are in the majority as faculty, your institution has a way of defanging you, or there's a way to do it. And there's tons of counterinsurgency, I think, happening at the writing level, at the way the academy teaches these or trains people to become these teachers. We're not becoming rural teachers, definitely not. We're not becoming that. We're becoming, how to become a good professor, in the professoriate, not in the struggle, not in the mass struggle for liberation. That's not what we're being taught. So that's kind of my, there's good things that can get it. I think it's definitely part of it, but there's a lot more work we can do to change it.
Right on. Thank you for that. I'll just add a quick note because Gary Okihiro passed away a couple months ago, and so just want to say rest in peace to him. Very very interesting figure, good writing, and I kind of learned of his work through Moon Ho Jung, who wrote a book called Menace to Empire: Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State, which is a really interesting study. And so anyways, just wanted to say that. Just shout out to those folks. They do great work. And yeah, thank you, Alex, again for joining us. David, thank you so much for participating and for developing questions. I think this was a really good conversation. Been great to be in discussion with both of you, and look forward to other things in the future. Maybe Blue Beetle watch party.
You're beating that Blue Beetle drum since it came out, homie. Like, yes,
Yeah.
like let's just make it happen, Jay. Let's do it. Yeah, it's super nice to
All
talk
right.
to you, Alex. Very nice to meet you here.
No, same.
And it was a
Same,
great convo.
David. Yeah, thank
All
you.
right.
No,
All
thank you.
right.
This was great. Thanks, Jay.
All right, thank you.